Thunder rumbled outside the Gothic windows of Courtroom 7B as Judge Margaret Ironhand Hartford towered over her domain like an empress on her throne, her obsidian robe crackling with each deliberate movement. Defendants' attorneys and even seasoned court reporters had been known to faint under her legendary death stare that could freeze hell itself. Today, she was sentencing a high profile embezzlement case while reporters sketched furiously in the corner, their pencils scratching against paper like mice trying to escape a sinking ship. The marble walls of Courtroom 7B had witnessed countless moments of judicial fury over the past 15 years since Judge Hartford first claimed this chamber, as her own whispered legends circulated through the courthouse about how she once made a seasoned defense attorney cry during a routine traffic violation, hearing the poor man had dared to chew gum in her presence. Now he exclusively practiced maritime law somewhere in Alaska. Every surface in her courtroom gleamed with military precision. Even the ancient brass handles on the heavy oak doors were polished daily by trembling custodians who scheduled their cleaning rounds at dawn to avoid her arrival. The American flag behind her bench never showed so much as a wrinkle, its stars and stripes standing as rigidly at attention as the bailiffs who guarded her domain. On this particular Wednesday afternoon, the air inside Courtroom 7B felt heavier than usual. Perhaps it was the approaching storm, or maybe it was the weight of the case itself. Richard Montgomery, the CEO of a local charity, stood accused of embezzling millions from a children's cancer foundation. His expensive Italian suit and gold cufflinks seemed to mock the very people he had sworn to help. Judge Hartford had spent the morning listening to testimony from parents whose children had been denied treatment when the foundation's funds mysteriously vanished. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with spectators, journalists, and law students who had been lining up since sunrise to witness what everyone expected would be a historic sentencing. Local newspapers had dubbed it the case of the cancer con, and Judge Hartford's reputation for handling white-collar crimes with particular severity had drawn attention from national media outlets. A sketch artist from the New York Times captured her essence with harsh charcoal strokes that seemed to catch the very lightning from the storm brewing outside. Judge Hartford adjusted her silver-rimmed glasses with deliberate slowness, a gesture that had become famous in legal circles as the calm before the storm. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her already severe features into an expression of perpetual judgment. The defendant, Richard Montgomery, shifted uncomfortably in his expensive leather shoes, which squeaked against the polished floor, breaking the suffocating silence. The sound of shuffling papers echoed through the chamber as Judge Hartford lifted the sentencing document, her movement causing her judicial robes to rustle like dark wings. The court recorder hunched over her stenotype machine, fingers hovering above the keys, ready to capture every withering word that was about to fall from the judge's lips like acid rain. The defense attorney had already loosened his tie, as if preparing for his own execution rather than his client's sentencing. Overhead, the antique chandelier cast shadows that danced across the judge's face, creating an effect that made her appear almost supernatural in her authority. The storm outside grew stronger, its deep rumbles providing a perfect backdrop to the drama unfolding within these hallowed walls. Even the most jaded courthouse veterans would later swear they had never witnessed such perfect theatrical timing as nature itself seemed to await Judge Hartford's proclamation. The air conditioning hummed in the background, mixing with the sound of nervous breathing from the gallery, where spectators sat rigid in their wooden benches, like parishioners awaiting the wrath of an Old Testament god. The prosecuting attorney maintained a poker face, but her white-knuckled grip on her legal pad betrayed her anticipation. Even the usually stoic bailiff kept glancing between the judge and the defendant as if watching a high-stakes tennis match. Just as Judge Hartford opened her mouth to begin pronouncing sentence, a particularly violent thunderclap shook the building, causing the chandelier's crystals to tinkle ominously above. Everyone immediately interpreted this as divine endorsement of whatever punishment she was about to deliver. The defendant, Richard Montgomery, finally showed his first crack of emotion, a single bead of sweat rolling down his temple leaving a glistening trail that caught the fluorescent lighting like a snail's path. Sarah Chen clutched her growling stomach in the back row. Her mother's civil suit about workplace discrimination was for another hour, but their car had broken down, forcing them to arrive early. The 12-year-old prodigy had skipped lunch to finish her science fair project about sound waves and vibrations, never imagining those same principles would soon turn her world upside down. Her bright yellow backpacks, stuffed with homework, seemed to mock her empty stomach as she shifted uncomfortably on the hard wooden bench. The morning had started normally enough. Sarah had woken up at exactly 6:15 am just like every school day to help her mother prepare breakfast for her younger siblings, while their mom ironed her court. Appearance outfit with trembling hands today was supposed to be a turning point for the Chen family after 2 years of workplace harassment and unfair treatment at the prestigious research laboratory where Mrs. Chen worked as a senior biochemist. The case would finally be heard. The weight of their future hung in the balance, along with the mounting bills that had piled up since her mother had been forced to take unpaid leave. Sarah had spent her morning classes, distracted, her mind wandering to complex equations about acoustic frequencies, while her stomach performed its own experiments in hunger. During third period physics, her favorite teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had praised her sound wave project, but Sarah barely registered the compliment, her thoughts consumed by the sight of her mother practicing her testimony in front of the bathroom mirror at dawn, mouth moving silently like a prayer. The science fair project sat partially disassembled in her backpack, its carefully crafted display board showing how sound waves travel through different mediums. Sarah had chosen the topic after reading about courthouse acoustics in a library book. The irony of now sitting in an actual courtroom was not lost on her, even as her stomach threatened to demonstrate its own theories about sound propagation. The project had already won first place at her school, earning her a spot at the regional competition next month. But now those blue ribbons and certificates seemed less important than the legal papers her mother clutched like a lifeline. Watching the embezzlement case unfold before her, Sarah observed how sound behaved in the vast courtroom: the click of heels against marble, the whispered consultations between lawyers, the rustle of papers, all creating a symphony of justice that would normally fascinate her scientific mind if only she could focus through the gnawing emptiness in her belly. Shed meant to grab something from the vending machine, but her last $3 had gone to her sister Lily for her field trip lunch tomorrow. The granola bar she usually kept for emergencies had been given to her best friend Maya during yesterday's track practice when Maya had nearly fainted from low blood sugar. Sarah never regretted helping others, but now her own stomach felt like it was trying to digest itself. The apple she planned to eat during student council meeting had rolled out of her lunch bag and been trampled in the hallway rush, leaving her with nothing but mint gum, which her mother always said would only make her hungrier. Sarah tried to distract herself by counting the ceiling tiles, analyzing the angle of the judge's bench, and calculating the approximate volume of the courtroom in cubic meters, but her usually sharp mind kept wandering to thoughts of the leftover dumplings sitting in their refrigerator at home waiting for dinner. Her mother had made them last night, stress cooking, as she always did before important events. The familiar smell of ginger and scallions had filled their small apartment like a warm hug. The defendant in the expensive suit reminded her of Miss Harrison, the laboratory director who had made her mother's life miserable for reporting safety violations. Sarah watched him fidget under Judge Hartford's stern gaze and felt a small satisfaction even as another hunger pang twisted her insides. The young girl shifted her weight, again trying to find a comfortable position on the ancient wooden bench that seemed designed specifically to torture fidgety middle schoolers, her stomach choosing this moment of movement to voice its loudest protest yet. Just as Judge Hartford was declaring maximum sentencing for the embezzler whose face had turned ghost white, Sarah's stomach unleashed a sound that could only be described as a dying quail performing opera. The acoustically perfect courtroom amplified the growl, making it echo like thunder off the marble walls. Several jurors gasped, one rookie lawyer dropped his files, and the court stenographer actually screamed. The sound seemed to take on a life of its own, bouncing from ceiling to floor in waves, exactly like the diagrams in Sarah's science fair project. The initial growl lasted exactly 3.4 seconds. Sarah counted mentally as her scientific brain kicked in automatically. Despite her mortification, it started as a low rumble building to a crescendo that might have impressed her physics teacher in any other circumstance. The sound contained at least three distinct frequencies, she noted absently while trying to slide under the bench and possibly through the floor into the Earth's core, where she might escape this nightmare. Time seemed to slow down as the echo reverberated through the courthouse chamber. Sarah watched in horror as heads turned in perfect synchronization, like a well choreographed dance number in a musical about judicial embarrassment. The defense attorney, who had been nervously shuffling his papers, froze mid shuffle, his mouth forming a perfect O of surprise that would have been comical in any other situation. The court artist actually began sketching the scene with rapid strokes, perhaps sensing this was a moment that needed to be preserved for posterity. The embezzler himself momentarily forgot his impending doom and turned around along with everyone else, his eyebrows raised so high they threatened to escape his forehead. Entirely in the front row, a group of law students who had been furiously taking notes about judicial procedures suddenly found a new topic of interest, their pens hovering above legal pads as they waited to see how the infamous Judge Hartford would handle this unprecedented interruption of court decorum. Sarah's mother, who had been sitting in the middle of the gallery preparing for her own case, reached desperately for her daughter's hand, missing entirely as her eyes remained locked on Judge Hartford, like a deer watching an approaching freight train. The yellow backpack that had been sitting quietly beside Sarah now felt like a beacon, drawing every eye in the room to her location, its bright color seeming to scream, "Here sits the perpetrator of the great courtroom brawl of 2025. The bailiff, who had been standing at attention by the judge's bench, actually took a step forward as if unsure whether he needed to arrest a growling stomach for contempt of court, his hand hovering uncertainly over his belt, while his eyes darted between Sarah and the judge, seeking guidance in a situation that clearly hadn't been covered in his training manual. Even the usually unflappable court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers frozen above her stenotype machine, as if unsure how to transcribe the sound of total social destruction. Somewhere in the gallery, a nervous laugh started and was immediately swallowed by the thick silence that followed. The legendary acoustics of Courtroom 7B, which had moments ago betrayed Sarah so spectacularly, now amplified the sound of her ragged breathing and the rustle of her jacket as she tried to make herself as small as possible. She could feel the heat radiating from her face, certain that she must be glowing like a red traffic light. The bag of chips she had decided not to buy from the vending machine earlier now haunted her like a greasy ghost of decisions past. The sound had interrupted Judge Hartford at the exact moment she had been saying maximum, making the word hang unfinished in the air like an abandoned high note. The judge had stopped speaking mid-syllable, her mouth still formed around the word max, as if the universe itself had hit a cosmic pause button. Sarah noticed with rising panic that her own science fair project about sound waves and acoustics was partially visible, peeking out of her backpack, its title Acoustic Resonance in Large Spaces, seeming now like a particularly cruel joke from the universe. Time froze. Judge Hartford stopped mid-sentence, her head snapping up like a cobra spotting prey, her eyes locked onto Sarah with laser precision through her silver-rimmed glasses. The entire courtroom turned in slow motion, horror dawning on their faces as they realized they were about to witness the judicial equivalent of a volcanic eruption. Sarah could feel her soul trying to escape through her shoes, while her mind calculated the exact mathematical probability of spontaneous human combustion. The judge rose from her chair with the fluid grace of a predator, her black robes billowing around her like storm clouds gathering before a hurricane. The wooden judge's chair scraped against the elevated platform with a sound that made several spectators flinch as if it were fingernails on a chalkboard. Her standing height of 5 feet 9 inches seemed to stretch into something mythological as she loomed over her domain, like an ancient goddess of justice preparing to smite an unfortunate mortal. Sarah noticed with scientific detachment that could only come from extreme terror that her palms were producing approximately twice the normal amount of sweat. Her brain helpfully supplied that this was due to her sympathetic nervous system's fight or flight response. Although both fighting and fleeing seemed equally impossible at this moment, the courtroom lights reflected off Judge Hartford's glasses, creating two perfect circles of bright white that reminded Sarah of searchlights hunting for escaped prisoners. The defendant, whose own sentencing had been interrupted, appeared to have temporarily forgotten about his impending prison term, his head swiveling between the judge and Sarah like a tennis spectator at a particularly intense match. His expensive lawyer had dropped his Montblanc pen, which rolled across the floor with a sound that seemed as loud as a bowling ball in the crystalline silence. Even the usual creaks and groans of the old courthouse seemed to have gone quiet, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Judge Hartford stepped down from her bench, each footfall echoing like a drumbeat in a funeral march, her robes swishing against the stairs in a rhythm that Sarah's panicked brain converted into musical notation. Quarter note, half note dressed her own heartbeat, providing a rapid percussion accompaniment that surely must be audible to everyone in the room given the courtroom's perfect acoustic properties, which she had studied so carefully for her project. The gallery of spectators parted like the Red Sea as the judge moved through the center aisle, her progress marked by the sound of bodies shifting hurriedly out of her path, the squeaking of shoes against polished wood, and the rustling of clothing creating a symphony of nervous movement. Sarah remained frozen in place, her scientific mind suddenly useless in calculating an escape route from this situation. Her mother's hand had found hers at last, gripping it with the strength of parental panic. Overhead, the ancient chandelier caught the afternoon light, splitting it into 1,000 tiny rainbows that danced across the judge's approaching form like nature itself was trying to add dramatic lighting to the scenes. Sarah noticed that her vision had narrowed to a tunnel focused entirely on the judge's face, which seemed to grow larger with each step closer. Her brain helpfully reminded her that this was another effect of her fight or flight response, though the information seemed particularly unhelpful at this moment. The temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop several degrees as Judge Hartford drew nearer, or perhaps it was just the cold sweat breaking out across Sarah's forehead. The bailiff stood at attention, his face a mask of professional neutrality, though his eyes betrayed a hint of sympathy that somehow made the situation even more terrifying. Sarah could hear her science project papers rustling in her backpack, the sound waves diagram seeming to mock her current situation with its neat, orderly depiction of acoustic behavior. The judge rose from her chair, seeming to grow 10 feet tall as her robe billowed around her. The defendant actually crossed himself, watching her approach the gallery, but then something extraordinary happened. Judge Hartford's face changed as she noticed Sarah's science fair ribbon peeking out of her backpack. A memory stirred of another young girl 4 decades ago who had caused a similar disruption while reading a physics book in her father's courtroom. The memory hit her with the force of a gavel strike, sharp and sudden and undeniable. It was 1985 and young Margaret Hartford had been sitting in the back of her father's courtroom, completely absorbed in an advanced physics textbook about wave propagation and sound theory. Her stomach had betrayed her during a particularly tense moment of a murder trial. Her father, Judge Theodore Hartford, had stopped proceedings immediately, his face turning that particular shade of purple that she would later perfect herself. But instead of punishment, he had called a 15-minute recess and silently passed her his own lunch wrapped in wax paper, a gesture that had shaped her more than any legal precedent. Now looking at Sarah, Judge Hartford saw herself reflected across the decades, the same burning curiosity for science, the same unfortunate timing, the same mortified expression that she herself had worn that day in 1985. She noticed the girl's backpack bursting with books, advanced physics texts that no ordinary 12-year-old would carry, the same kind she used to hide under her pillow with a flashlight. The science fair project, visible through the half-zipped bag, was about acoustic waves and sound propagation in large spaces, exactly the topic that had fascinated her at that age. The courtroom held its collective breath as something unprecedented occurred. The corners of Judge Hartford's mouth twitched upward, not in her usual expression of imminent doom, but in what astounded observers would later swear was an actual smile. Decades of carefully cultivated courtroom terror began to crack like ice in spring as memories continued to flood back. The long hours spent in courtrooms as a child, the way her father had balanced justice with humanity, the lesson she had somehow forgotten in her pursuit of perfect judicial order. She noticed other details now that her focus had shifted. Sarah Chen, according to the visitor's log, was clutching a notebook filled with complex equations that peeked out alongside the science fair ribbon. The equations were far beyond middle school level. Just as her own had been at that age, the girl's mother sat beside her in a carefully pressed suit reminiscent of her own mother's court attire all those years ago. When she would attend her father's proceedings, the parallel was striking enough to momentarily take her breath away. The gallery watched in stunned silence as Judge Hartford's legendary steel gaze softened almost imperceptibly, her ramrod straight posture gentling by a fraction of a degree that only the most observant court watchers would notice, but those who did would talk about for years to come. The defendant and his lawyer exchanged confused glances as the temperature in the room seemed to rise from subarctic to merely chilly. The bailiff, who had served with her for 15 years, actually blinked twice in rapid succession, a gesture that for him qualified as extreme shock. Sarah, still trapped in her seat by terror, failed to notice these subtle changes, her eyes squeezed shut in anticipation of judicial wrath. But Judge Hartford saw something else in the girl's face. Beneath the embarrassment and fear there lurked that same passionate curiosity that had driven her own journey from physics enthusiast to law school valedictorian to the bench. She saw the familiar signs of a mind that questioned everything, that sought to understand the underlying principles of the universe, whether they governed sound waves or justice. To everyone's astonishment, Judge Hartford reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a granola bar that she kept for long sessions. She gestured for the bailiff, who understood immediately, and walked over to Sarah, presenting the snack with a subtle wink. This particular granola bar had been part of the judge's courtroom survival kit for years, a secret stash that until now only her bailiff, Officer Rodriguez, had known about. It was her favorite brand, dark chocolate and almond, a combination that had fueled countless late-night sessions poring over case files. Officer Rodriguez moved through the gallery with practiced precision, his polished shoes making no sound against the marble floor, a skill developed over 15 years of serving in Judge Hartford's courtroom. As he approached Sarah, he remembered his own daughter, about the same age, and how she too seemed to be perpetually hungry, growing faster than their grocery budget could handle. The granola bar in his white-gloved hand felt like a peace offering between generations, a bridge between the austere world of adult justice and the simple needs of a growing child. The entire courtroom watched this unprecedented scene unfold with expressions ranging from disbelief to wonder. The defendant, whose own fate hung in the balance, momentarily forgotten, stared open-mouthed, as though head stumbled into an alternate dimension where the dreaded iron hand. Hartford showed mercy. The court reporter had stopped typing entirely, her fingers hovering above the keys as she tried to decide if this moment should be entered into the official record or if it was some sort of mass hallucination. Sarah stared at the approaching bailiff, her scientific mind struggling to process this unexpected deviation from the predicted outcome of events. According to her calculations, based on Judge Hartford's reputation, there had been a 98.7% chance of immediate ejection from the courtroom, possibly followed by permanent banishment from the judicial system. Instead, the granola bar glinted in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the high windows like some sort of legally sanctioned miracle. The law students in the front row frantically scribbled notes as though witnessing a historic precedent in judicial snack distribution, their legal pads filling with observations that would become legendary in the law school cafeteria. By dinner time, one particularly bold student even raised her phone to take a picture before remembering the strict no photography rule and quickly dropping it back into her bag, but not before the bailiff shot her a warning glance that could have frozen coffee. Officer Rodriguez reached Sarah's row, and with the ceremonial gravity usually reserved for presenting evidence to the jury, held out the granola bar perched on his pristine white gloved palm. The chocolate coating had started to melt slightly from his body heat, creating a tiny smudge on the white fabric, a detail that would have normally sent Judge Hartford into a fury over courtroom decorum. But today she merely watched with what could almost be described as amusement, if anyone had dared to use such a word in connection with her. The granola bar wrapper crinkled in the perfect acoustics of the courtroom, creating a sound wave that Sarah's brain automatically began to analyze before she caught herself, the noise bouncing off the marble walls in a pattern that perfectly matched the diagram in her science fair project about sound propagation in large spaces. Officer Rodriguez maintained his position of parade rest as he waited for her to accept the offering, his face a masterpiece of professional neutrality, masking the tiny smile that threatened to break through. The tension in the courtroom dissolved into confused murmurs as Sarah accepted the granola bar. With trembling hands, Judge Hartford cleared her throat, and the silence returned, but this time it felt different, less oppressive, somehow more human. The sound of the wrapper crinkling echoed through the chamber as Sarah carefully opened her unexpected gift, each tiny sound amplified by the room's famous acoustics, creating a symphony of cellophane that her scientific mind automatically began to analyze. Judge Hartford did something then that would become legendary in courthouse circles. She began to speak, not in her usual tone that could strip paint from walls, but in a voice that carried warmth like afternoon sunlight through the high windows. She revealed that she was known in certain exclusive judicial circles for her stress baking, a hobby that had started during her first year of law school when she had nearly burned down her apartment trying to perfect her chocolate chip cookie recipe while studying for finals. The revelation sent ripples of astonishment through the gallery as Judge Hartford continued speaking. She shared how she had once disrupted the Supreme Court with a recouping fit while arguing her first case as a young attorney, a story that had never before been uttered aloud in any courtroom. The defendant temporarily forgot his impending sentencing as he, along with everyone else, listened spellbound to the tale of how a young Margaret Hartford had tried everything from drinking water upside down to holding her breath, while Chief Justice Warren Burger himself had attempted to maintain order. Sarah took her first bite of the granola bar, the dark chocolate and almonds combining perfectly on her tongue as Judge Hartford described her own court appearances as a novice lawyer when she had learned the hard way about always keeping emergency snacks on hand. The judge explained how she now kept a stash of precisely arranged granola bars in her desk, each one positioned at exactly 45 degrees for optimal grabbing efficiency during extended sessions, her organizational system reflecting the same precision she brought to judicial matters. The courtroom itself seemed to relax, its marble walls and heavy wooden furnishings absorbing the judge's words like they had absorbed thousands of legal arguments before. But this time the acoustics carried something different, stories of humanity threading through the formal atmosphere like warm butter melting into toast. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows softened, creating a gentle glow that seemed to approve of this unexpected turn of events. Officer Rodriguez stood at his usual post by the judge's bench, but his posture had shifted subtly, years of military training battling with the urge to smile as Judge Hartford shared how she had once caught him sneaking one of her emergency granola bars during a particularly long drug trafficking case. She had forgiven him, she explained, because he had replaced it the next day with 2 bars and a handwritten apology note formatted in perfect legal brief style, complete with citations to precedent cases involving snack-related infractions. The law students in the front row had abandoned all pretense of formal note-taking, their legal pads now filling with hastily scrawled accounts of this unprecedented glimpse into judicial humanity. One of them would later go on to write a law review article titled "The Granola Doctrine: How Small Acts of Kindness Shape Judicial Philosophy." The court reporter, whose fingers had been frozen in shock, finally began typing, again preserving every word of this remarkable moment for the official record. Sarah's mother, who had been holding her breath since the initial stomach growl, finally exhaled, her hand relaxing its death grip on her folder of workplace discrimination evidence as she watched her daughter become the catalyst for what would later be referred to as the Great Thawing of Courtroom 7B. Even the ancient courthouse ghost, rumored to haunt the judicial chambers, seemed to pause in its eternal wandering to witness this transformation. As the last crumbs of the granola bar disappeared, Sarah noticed something else. The acoustics of the courtroom had changed subtly, or perhaps she was just hearing them differently now, the formal echoes softening into something that reminded her of the way sound traveled in her family's kitchen during weekend dinners when laughter and conversation bounced off the walls in warm waves. Her scientific mind began formulating a hypothesis about the relationship between emotional atmosphere and sound propagation, a theory that would eventually lead to an award-winning science fair project titled The Acoustic Properties of Kindness in Formal Spaces. Sarah discovered between bites that Judge Hartford wore mismatched socks, one covered in quantum physics formulas, the other depicting famous female scientists. The judge had been a science fair champion herself back in 1975 with a project about courthouse acoustics. The revelation came about when the judge shifted her position, causing her judicial robe to move just enough to reveal this secret glimpse of personality beneath her fearsome exterior. From Sarah's unique angle in the back row, she had a perfect view of this remarkable wardrobe choice that would soon become courthouse legend. The socks were no ordinary novelty items, but rather specially designed academic, where the left sock featured intricately printed quantum mechanics equations complete with Schrodinger's wave function and Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, while the right sock showcased portraits of Marie Curie, Rosalind Franklin, and other pioneering women of science, each tiny face rendered in surprising detail against the black background. Sarah nearly choked on her granola bar when she realized that the equations on the left sock were the same ones she'd been studying for her advanced physics club. Judge Hartford, noticing Sarah's widened eyes and dropped jaw, deliberately crossed her ankles, allowing more of the socks to become visible to the amazed 12-year-old. The movement caused a collective gasp from those in the gallery who could see this unprecedented display. The court artist frantically added this detail to their sketch, knowing it would become a pivotal part of courthouse history. The defense attorney actually cleaned his glasses and put them back on, certain he must be seeing things. Encouraged by Sarah's obvious scientific interest, Judge Hartford revealed that she had been president of both the physics club and the mock trial team in high school, a combination that had baffled her guidance counselor but had made perfect sense to her teenage self. She explained how she had used her understanding of acoustics to perfect her courtroom presence, calculating exactly how her voice would carry to create maximum impact, her scientific background informing her legal career in unexpected ways. The quantum physics equations on her left sock, she explained, had helped her win her first major case as a young attorney when she had to explain complex probability theories to a jury in a patent dispute. Her ability to translate scientific concepts into layman's terms had become her secret weapon in the courtroom. The portraits of female scientists on her right sock served as a daily reminder that boundaries were meant to be broken and conventional wisdom challenged. Sarah, leaning forward in her seat, now completely forgot about her earlier embarrassment as Judge Hartford described her own science fair project from 1975, a comprehensive study of sound wave propagation in the old courthouse building. She had used primitive equipment by today's standards, but her findings about acoustic sweet spots in the courtroom were still referenced by architects designing modern judicial chambers. Her father, the previous judge, had allowed her to conduct experiments after hours, setting up microphones and speakers throughout the building. The law students, who had been furiously taking notes about judicial precedent and legal theory, now found themselves scribbling diagrams of wave functions and architectural acoustics, their legal pads becoming an unexpected blend of law and physics. Officer Rodriguez, standing at his usual post, smiled knowingly. He had been the one who had given Judge Hartford these particular socks as a birthday gift last year after overhearing her quote Schrödinger during a particularly complex case. From that day forward, Judge Hartford became known for keeping a basket of granola bars in her courtroom, available to anyone who needed one. Her reputation for strictness remained, but it was now tempered with understanding. The incident became a favorite story among courthouse regulars who would smile knowingly whenever they heard a stomach growl during proceedings. The basket itself was a masterpiece of judicial organization, with different varieties arranged by flavor profile and nutritional content, each bar positioned at precisely calculated angles for optimal accessibility. The transformation of Courtroom 7B became the subject of numerous law review articles and even a chapter in a legal textbook about judicial temperament. The infamous Iron Hand Hartford maintained her legendary status, but stories began circulating about other moments of unexpected kindness, how she would pause proceedings when a young lawyer seemed overwhelmed, offering them a granola bar and a moment to collect themselves. The court artist who had captured the original Hungry Girl incident had their sketch framed and hung in the courthouse cafeteria, where it became known as the Great Granola Moment. Sarah Chen went on to win the state science fair with her project on courthouse acoustics and sound wave propagation. Judge Hartford served as her mentor, sharing decades of observational data about how different emotional atmospheres affected sound travel in the courtroom. Their collaboration led to a groundbreaking paper published in both legal and scientific journals titled The Physics of Justice: How Acoustic Properties Influence Judicial Proceedings. The paper featured an appendix about the mathematical probability of stomach growls during key legal moments. Officer Rodriguez adapted his security protocols to include what he officially termed nutritional emergency response, maintaining a strategic reserve of snacks in various courthouse locations. His military precision finding a new outlet in the organization of granola bar supplies. The original white glove with its chocolate smudge was ceremonially framed and added to the courthouse museum alongside other historical artifacts like the first gavel used in the building and photographs of landmark cases. The defendant, whose sentencing had been interrupted by Sarah's stomach, later wrote from prison that the incident had helped him understand the human side of justice. He started a program teaching science to fellow inmates, focusing on the physics of sound and the chemistry of baking. The justice system, he realized, operated not just on rules and procedures, but on the fundamental humanity that connected everyone in the courtroom that day. Judge Hartford's sock collection became legendary. She now openly coordinated her scientific socks with different types of cases, wearing quantum physics patterns for complex technical disputes and molecular biology designs for medical malpractice suits. Young lawyers started their own tradition of wearing science-themed socks to court, considering them a good luck charm. The courthouse gift shop even began selling judicial socks, complete with equations and portraits of famous scientists. The granola bar basket sparked a wider movement in the legal community. Other judges, inspired by Hartford's example, began considering the human needs of courtroom participants. Some installed water stations, others adjusted scheduling to accommodate meal breaks. The American Bar Association eventually published guidelines on courtroom accessibility and comfort titled Beyond the Bench, Creating Human-Centered Judicial Spaces, with Judge Hartford writing the foreword. Sarah returned to Courtroom 7B years later as a law student herself, wearing her own pair of quantum physics socks and carrying granola bars in her briefcase. She sat in the same back row where her stomach had once caused a revolution in judicial temperament, watching as Judge Hartford, now silver-haired but sharp as ever, maintained perfect order in her courtroom while keeping one desk drawer stocked with emergency snacks for those moments when justice and hunger collided.